A racist salesman humiliates a black girl by forcing her to eat a hot pepper in front of a crowd. But what happened afterward changed their town forever. Subscribe, share this video, and tell us where you're watching it from. The bus screeched to a halt, stirring up a small cloud of dust as it pulled into the modest station. Aaliyah stepped off cautiously, clutching her faded canvas backpack. Her braided hair glistened under the relentless midday sun, and the vibrant scarf around her neck fluttered slightly in the breeze. The air smelled of dry grass and sun-warmed asphalt, a sharp contrast to the humid city air she was used to. This was her first time in her grandmother's town, a quiet, sleepy place that seemed to have been forgotten by time. As Aaliyah adjusted her bag on her shoulder, she looked around. The station was more of a shed than an actual building, with a hand-painted wooden sign hanging crookedly overhead. A few locals lingered nearby, their weathered faces painted with faint curiosity. Most of them were older, dressed in simple clothes, their gazes flicking toward Aaliyah briefly before they looked away. She felt it immediately, the weight of being different. Back home in the bustling, diverse city where she lived with her parents, she was just another face in the crowd. Here, in this small, predominantly white town, her dark skin and braided hair stood out like a beacon. She took a deep breath, determined not to let it bother her. This summer was about spending time with her grandmother, someone she admired deeply. Her grandmother, Margaret, was waiting for her just beyond the station's boundary, sitting in her small, faded blue car. She waved enthusiastically, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun. Aaliyah's heart swelled with affection. Grandmother Margaret was a petite woman with a strong presence, her wiry frame a testament to years of hard work in her beloved garden. "Aaliyah, darling," Margaret exclaimed as she stepped out of the car, her arms outstretched. Aaliyah ran to her, enveloped in a warm hug that smelled of lavender and soil. "You look more grown up every time I see you." Aaliyah smiled. "It's good to see you, Grandma. It's been too long." Margaret helped Aaliyah load her bag into the trunk before they set off for the house. The drive was short, winding through narrow streets lined with quaint houses and neatly trimmed hedges. Margaret chatted animatedly about her garden and the upcoming summer festival, filling the silence with her comforting voice. As they arrived, Aaliyah couldn't help but admire the small white cottage surrounded by an explosion of colors. Margaret's garden was a masterpiece of nature. Rows of daisies, tulips, and marigolds danced in the breeze, their vivid hues contrasting sharply with the deep green of the leaves. The house itself was simple but charming, with a wraparound porch and a wooden swing that creaked slightly in the wind. Aaliyah spent the first few days settling in, helping her grandmother with the garden and getting to know the rhythm of life in the town. However, it didn't take long for her to notice the unease in the air whenever she stepped out of the house. The first incident occurred at the local grocery store. She had walked in to buy bread, greeted by the jingling of a small bell above the door. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, glanced at her briefly before returning to his task. Aaliyah browsed the shelves, selecting a loaf of bread and a small jar of jam. As she approached the counter, she noticed how the man's eyes flicked over her, his expression guarded. "That'll be $3.50, he said, his tone neutral but distant. Aaliyah handed over the money, but as she turned to leave, she heard him mutter, "Not from around here, are you?" The comment was barely audible, but it stung. Aaliyah didn't respond, instead walking out with her head held high. Outside, she saw a group of children playing with a ball. They stopped as she passed, their chatter silenced. One of the boys whispered something, and they all burst into nervous giggles before running off. Aaliyah clenched her fists, swallowing the lump in her throat. At first, she tried to brush it off. Perhaps they were just curious. But as the days went by, the subtle whispers and lingering stares became impossible to ignore. It seemed that everyone in the town had noticed her presence, and few were willing to make her feel welcome. One evening, as she helped her grandmother water the garden, she decided to bring it up. "Grandma, have you noticed how people look at me? It's like I'm different." Margaret paused, her watering can mid-air. She sighed, setting it down and wiping her hands on her apron. "Aaliyah, this town, it's set in its ways. People here aren't used to seeing someone as bright and bold as you." "Bright and bold?" Aaliyah scoffed. "It feels more like I'm unwanted." Margaret reached out, taking Aaliyah's hand in hers. "You are wanted, my dear. By me, by this garden, by anyone who matters. But yes, there's ignorance here. Don't let it dim your light." Her grandmother's words were comforting, but they didn't erase the discomfort Aaliyah felt every time she stepped out of the house. The town wasn't just small, it was insular. She was an outsider in every sense, and no amount of kindness from her grandmother could change that. The turning point came a week later when Margaret asked Aaliyah to join her on a trip to the market. "It's the best place to get fresh produce," Margaret explained, her voice cheerful as always, "and I'd love for you to meet some of the vendors." Aaliyah hesitated but agreed. As they walked to the market, Margaret greeted everyone they passed with a warm smile. Some returned her greetings enthusiastically, while others glanced briefly at Aaliyah before mumbling a response. The market was bustling, filled with stalls overflowing with fruits, vegetables, and handmade goods. The air was thick with the scent of ripe peaches and freshly baked bread. But as they moved through the crowd, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers were back, and this time they were louder. Margaret led her to a stall run by a burly man with a booming voice. "Ah, Mrs. Margaret, always a pleasure," he said, his smile broad. But when his eyes shifted to Aaliyah, his expression faltered for a split second before he recovered. "And who's this?" "This is my granddaughter, Aaliyah," Margaret said proudly. "She's staying with me for the summer." The man nodded, his smile now polite but strained. "Well, welcome to our little town," he said, though his tone suggested anything but warmth. Aaliyah forced a smile, her stomach twisting. She could feel the stares, the judgment. This town wasn't just different. It was hostile in ways she hadn't anticipated. As they left the market, Aaliyah's resolve hardened. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let this summer pass without standing up for herself. She just didn't know what lay ahead. The sun was already high in the sky when Aaliyah woke up to the sounds of her grandmother humming in the kitchen. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the small house, mingling with the floral aroma of the garden outside. Aaliyah stretched lazily, savoring the rare peace of the morning. "Aaliyah," Margaret called, her voice cheerful, "come have breakfast, dear. Then we'll go over to the market. I'm running low on peaches and a few other things." Aaliyah tensed at the mention of the market. Memories of the stares and whispers from her last visit lingered, but she masked her unease. She didn't want to disappoint her grandmother, who seemed oblivious to the hostility around her. After breakfast, Margaret handed Aaliyah a small woven basket. "Why don't you go ahead to the fruit stand while I visit Mr. James for some seeds? You remember where it is, don't you?" Aaliyah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. She set off toward the bustling market, her grandmother's words of encouragement still echoing in her mind. "People are just people," Margaret had said over breakfast, They'll get used to you, Aaliyah. Just give them time. The market was alive with activity, its narrow paths crowded with people bartering and chatting. Vendors shouted their deals into the warm air, their voices mixing with the clinking of coins and the rustle of paper bags. Aaliyah made her way through the chaos, gripping the basket tightly as she scanned the stalls. Finally, she found the fruit stand her grandmother had mentioned. A large man with a ruddy face stood behind the counter, arranging an array of brightly colored produce. His hands moved quickly, deftly rearranging peaches and apples into neat pyramids. "Excuse me," Aaliyah said softly, stepping closer. The man looked up, his expression shifting as he took her in. His polite smile faded, replaced by a guarded, almost suspicious look. "What do you need?" he asked curtly. Aaliyah hesitated, her confidence wavering under his scrutinizing gaze. "I'd like some peaches, please. 3 or 4. The man grunted and turned to grab the peaches. As he did, Aaliyah noticed a small pile of plums nearby. She picked one up, admiring its deep purple hue, but decided against it and placed it back. When the man returned with the peaches, his eyes flicked to the plums, his face darkened. "What are you doing?" he barked. Aaliyah froze, confused. I was just looking." "Looking or stealing?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I wasn't stealing," Aaliyah protested, panic creeping into her voice. Her heart pounded as several shoppers stopped to watch the commotion. The man stepped out from behind the counter, his large frame looming over her. "Don't lie to me. I saw you take it," he said, pointing an accusing finger at her. "I didn't take anything." Aaliyah's voice cracked, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but the crowd only stared, some whispering amongst themselves. "Don't believe her," someone muttered. "You know how they are." Aaliyah's stomach churned. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "You think you can come here and take whatever you want," the man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Well, let's see how you like a taste of the real world." He reached behind the counter and grabbed a long, bright red pepper. Aaliyah stared at it in confusion and fear as he thrust it toward her. "Here," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Bite it. Maybe then you'll learn what happens when you mess with me." Aaliyah shook her head, stepping back. "No, please." "Bite it," he roared, the crowd now fully focused on the spectacle. "Or I'll make you eat the whole thing." The pepper's glossy surface seemed to glow in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the dark pit forming in Aaliyah's chest. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized she had no choice. Her hands trembling, she took the pepper and bit into it. The burn was immediate and excruciating. It spread across her tongue and down her throat like wildfire, making her eyes water and her breathing ragged. She coughed violently, dropping the pepper as the crowd erupted into laughter. "Now you know what life's really like," the man sneered. "And if you tell anyone about this, I'll make sure you regret it." Aaliyah stumbled back, her vision blurred by tears. She could feel the heat spreading through her body, her throat constricting with every breath. The humiliation was worse than the physical pain. She turned and ran, clutching her basket tightly to her chest, her sobs drowned out by the noise of the market. Back at home, Margaret found Aaliyah curled up on the porch swing, her face buried in her hands. She immediately rushed over, her heart breaking at the sight of her granddaughter's distress. "Aaliyah, what happened?" Margaret asked, kneeling beside her. Aaliyah looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't do anything, Grandma," she choked out. "But he made me." Her voice trailed off as another wave of sobs overtook her. Margaret pulled her into a tight hug, stroking her hair gently. "Oh, my sweet girl," she murmured. "I'm so sorry." As Aaliyah recounted the incident through broken words and trembling breaths, Margaret's expression hardened. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "We'll handle this, Aaliyah. You don't deserve to be treated this way." But as night fell and the house grew quiet, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. She replayed the scene in her mind over and over, the laughter of the crowd ringing in her ears. Her grandmother's promise was comforting, but deep down, Aaliyah knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. Aaliyah sat at the small kitchen table, pushing her breakfast around on her plate. The events at the market lingered in her mind like a bad dream, replaying with excruciating clarity. Her grandmother had tried to comfort her the night before, but the humiliation and fear were too fresh, too raw. Margaret sat across from her, her brow furrowed in concern. "You barely touched your eggs, sweetheart," she said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "You need to eat." Aaliyah looked up, her eyes clouded with emotion. "How can I eat when every time I step outside, people look at me like I don't belong? Or worse, like I'm some kind of criminal?" Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Aaliyah's. "I know it feels like the whole town is against you," she said, "but you have a right to be here, just like anyone else." Aaliyah hesitated, then whispered, "Why does everyone act like this? Why didn't anyone help me?" Margaret sighed deeply, her expression heavy with years of unspoken truths. "This town, it's small. People here don't like change. They fear what they don't understand. And sometimes fear turns into cruelty." That day, Margaret decided to take Aaliyah into town to run some errands. "It's important to show them that we won't be scared into hiding," she said firmly. Aaliyah agreed, though her stomach twisted with apprehension. As they walked through the streets, Aaliyah noticed the same cold stares and murmurs. At one point, a woman across the road nudged her companion and whispered something, glancing pointedly in Aaliyah's direction. Aaliyah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her head high, following her grandmother's lead. At the general store, Margaret struck up a conversation with an older woman named Mrs. Porter, a longtime family acquaintance. While they talked, Aaliyah wandered to the back of the store, browsing the shelves of canned goods and baking supplies. She turned a corner and nearly bumped into a girl her age, who was crouched down examining a shelf of cookies. The girl looked up, startled. She had auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and a face sprinkled with freckles. For a moment, they just stared at each other. "Hi," Aaliyah said cautiously. The girl hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Hi." Aaliyah tried to muster a friendly smile. "I'm Aaliyah. I'm staying with my grandmother for the summer." The girl stood up, her posture tense. "I'm Ellie," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced over her shoulder nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Before Aaliyah could say more, Ellie lowered her voice. "I saw what happened at the market." Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. "You did?" Ellie nodded, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry. That man, he's awful. He's done things like that before." "Before?" Aaliyah repeated, her brow furrowing. "To who?" Ellie hesitated, biting her lip. "There are others," she said finally. "Mostly kids. He's mean to anyone who can't fight back, but no one talks about it. Everyone's scared of him." Aaliyah felt a surge of anger. "Why? Why do they let him get away with it?" Ellie shrugged helplessly. He's been here forever. He knows everyone, and he has friends in the right places. If someone stands up to him, they risk losing their business or worse. The weight of Ellie's words sank in. Aaliyah had suspected that the market vendor's behavior wasn't new, but hearing it confirmed made her blood boil. She clenched her fists, the memory of the pepper's burning heat still vivid in her mind. "I'm not scared of him," Aaliyah said quietly but firmly. Ellie looked at her with a mix of admiration and fear. "Be careful," she said. "People who cross him don't usually come out on top." That evening, back at the cottage, Aaliyah shared her conversation with Ellie. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every word. "I knew that man was no good," Margaret said, shaking her head. "But I didn't realize how far his cruelty stretched." Aaliyah's mind was racing. "Grandma, if there are others, maybe we can do something. If we all speak up together, they can't ignore us." Margaret looked at her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "It's a noble idea, Aaliyah, but it's not that simple. People here are set in their ways, and fear is a powerful thing." "But I can't just do nothing," Aaliyah said, her voice trembling with frustration. "He humiliated me, Grandma, and he's done it to other people too. If no one stands up to him, he'll just keep getting away with it." Margaret reached out, placing a comforting hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. "You're brave, my dear, braver than most people in this town. If you're truly set on this, I'll support you, but you need to be careful. Change doesn't come easily in a place like this." Over the next few days, Aaliyah began to quietly investigate. She spent hours on the porch swing, her notebook in hand, jotting down ideas and strategies. She started talking to other kids and teens around town, carefully bringing up the topic of the market vendor. Some clammed up immediately, too scared to say anything, but a few, like Ellie, shared their stories. There was a boy named Sam who had been accused of stealing a watermelon when he was only 10. The vendor had made him stand in the middle of the market, holding a sign that read "Thief," while everyone laughed at him. Another girl, Emma, recounted how the vendor had shouted at her for touching a basket of apples and reduced her to tears. Aaliyah wrote everything down, her anger growing with each new story. It became clear that the market vendor's power was rooted in fear. People didn't speak out because they were afraid of what he might do to them or their families. But Aaliyah wasn't afraid anymore. She was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. One evening, she approached her grandmother with an idea. "Grandma, I want to record what's happening. I can use my phone to take pictures and videos. If I can show people what he's really like, maybe they'll stop being afraid." Margaret looked at her granddaughter with a mixture of worry and pride. "It's a risky plan, Aaliyah, but if you're sure, I'll help you." And so, with Margaret's support, Aaliyah began her mission. Armed with her phone and her growing resolve, she set out to gather evidence of the market vendor's cruelty, hoping to finally break the silence that had held the town captive for so long. Aaliyah sat on the porch swing, her phone gripped tightly in her hands. The warm evening air hummed with the distant sound of cicadas, but her mind was anything but calm. She had spent the past few days gathering courage and devising a plan. This wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about all the people who had suffered under the vendor's cruelty. She couldn't stay silent. Her notebook was open beside her, filled with pages of names, incidents, and strategies. Every story she had heard from Ellie, Sam, and Emma replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. Aaliyah had decided that she couldn't fight this battle alone. If the town was paralyzed by fear, then perhaps the solution lay beyond it. The next morning, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table, carefully setting up a new social media account on her phone. She chose an anonymous username, Voice of the Silenced. Her profile picture was a simple icon, a hand reaching toward the sky, a symbol of defiance and hope. Her first post was simple but bold. This is a place for the silenced to speak. If you've been hurt, humiliated, or mistreated in this town, share your story. Together, we can make a change. She stared at the screen for a long moment before hitting post. Her heart pounded as the message went live. It felt like she had just shouted into the void, hoping someone would hear her. At first, nothing happened. The account sat dormant, the single post buried in the endless noise of the internet. But Aaliyah didn't give up. Over the next few days, she uploaded photos she had secretly taken at the market. Pictures of the vendor's scowling face, his aggressive body language, and the downtrodden expressions of the people he targeted. She paired the photos with short captions. "This man has tormented our town for years. Why do we let him get away with it? Fear is his weapon, but we can break it together." Slowly, people began to notice. The account started gaining followers, at first just a few, then dozens. Aaliyah was shocked to see comments begin to appear under her posts. "I've seen him do this to my cousin. It was awful. Finally, someone is speaking out. Thank you. I was too scared to say anything, but now I think I might." For the first time, Aaliyah felt a spark of hope. Her words were resonating. People were paying attention. One afternoon, Aaliyah received a direct message from an anonymous account. The sender claimed to be another victim of the vendor, sharing a heartbreaking story of how their family had been publicly humiliated after a minor disagreement. They included a photo, a grainy image of the vendor pointing aggressively at a young boy who was crying. Aaliyah's chest tightened as she read the message. She realized that this wasn't just about exposing the vendor's actions. It was about creating a space where people felt safe to share their pain. She responded with empathy and encouragement, promising to amplify their voice. As more stories poured in, Aaliyah began compiling them into posts, carefully preserving the anonymity of the victims. Each story was like a puzzle piece, revealing the full picture of the vendor's reign of terror. The account quickly gained traction, spreading beyond the town's borders. Aaliyah's phone buzzed constantly with notifications as people from nearby areas began following her. Some shared their own experiences with bullying and injustice, creating a ripple effect of solidarity. But not everyone was supportive. Beneath the flood of positive comments, there were also messages of doubt and hostility. "Why are you hiding behind a screen? If this is true, show your face. This guy has been here for years. He's not going anywhere. Stay in your lane, kid. You're stirring up trouble where it's not needed." Aaliyah's resolve wavered at times, but she reminded herself why she had started this. The truth was worth the risk. One evening, while scrolling through her messages, Aaliyah noticed something strange. A new message had appeared, but it wasn't from a victim or a supporter. It was a threat. "You think you're brave? You don't know who you're messing with. Stop this now or you'll regret it." Aaliyah's hands trembled as she read the words. Her first instinct was to delete the message, but she stopped herself. Instead, she took a screenshot and saved it. This was evidence, too. When she showed the message to her grandmother, Margaret's face darkened. "This is getting dangerous, Aaliyah," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" Aaliyah nodded firmly. "They're trying to scare me into silence. That just proves I'm doing the right thing." Margaret sighed, her expression a mix of pride and worry. "If you're going to keep this up, you need to be smart about it. Don't go anywhere alone, and always let me know where you are." "I will," Aaliyah promised, "but I won't stop." The next day, Aaliyah's resolve was tested. While walking to the market with her grandmother, she noticed the vendor glaring at her from his stall. His face was twisted with anger, his lips moving as he muttered something under his breath. Aaliyah could feel the tension in the air, but she refused to look away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of him, her hands steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The vendor's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, but Margaret intervened. "Come on, Aaliyah," she said loudly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "We've got other things to do." As they walked away, Aaliyah felt a surge of adrenaline. The fear was still there, but so was her determination. That evening, Aaliyah uploaded the photo with a caption that read, "This is the face of intimidation, but his power is crumbling. Speak out, and let's bring him down together." The post exploded. Within hours, it had hundreds of likes and comments. People were sharing it widely, tagging friends and family. The momentum was undeniable, but with the growing attention came greater risks. Aaliyah knew she was walking a fine line. Every post, every story was a step closer to justice, but also a step closer to danger. Still, she couldn't stop now. The virus of truth was spreading, and she was determined to see it through. The market was alive with its usual bustle, but for Aaliyah, the noise felt sharper, the stares heavier. She walked beside her grandmother, her phone tucked securely in her pocket. Her social media account, Voice of the Silenced, had gained traction, and with it, attention from people who once turned a blind eye to the vendor's actions. But with the attention came a palpable tension. Margaret had insisted on accompanying Aaliyah today, knowing full well the risks. "If you're going back there, you won't be alone," she had said firmly. Aaliyah had agreed, grateful for her grandmother's unwavering support. Still, she couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. As they approached the fruit stall, Aaliyah felt her stomach twist. The vendor, a burly man with a scowl permanently etched on his face, was busy arranging crates of apples. His presence radiated hostility, a living embodiment of the fear he used to control the town. He spotted Aaliyah before she even reached the stall. "You?" he barked, his voice cutting through the chatter of the market. The crowd turned to look, their conversations silenced by the sharp edge of his tone. "What are you doing here?" Aaliyah squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his glare. "I'm here to buy fruit, just like everyone else." His lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can come back here after spreading lies about me? You've got some nerve, kid." Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Watch your tone. She has every right to be here." The vendor's eyes flicked to Margaret, then back to Aaliyah. "Rights? You think she has rights after what she's done, turning people against me with her little internet games?" Aaliyah could feel the heat rising in her face, but she refused to back down. "I didn't turn anyone against you. Your actions did that." The crowd began to grow, people stopping to watch the confrontation unfold. Whispers rippled through the group, some murmuring in support of Aaliyah, others too afraid to pick a side. The vendor slammed his hand on the counter, making the nearby crates rattle. "You don't know who you're messing with, girl. You think a few pictures and stories will take me down? I've been here longer than you've been alive. And in all those years, how many people have you hurt? Aaliyah shot back, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "How many kids have you humiliated? How many families have you threatened?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. The vendor's face darkened, but he said nothing. The crowd murmured louder now, shifting uneasily as they watched. Then, from the back of the group, a voice called out, "She's right." It was Ellie, her face pale but resolute. She stepped forward, clutching her hands together tightly. "He's done this to me, to my little brother. We were too scared to say anything, but not anymore." The vendor glared at Ellie, his fists clenching at his sides. "Lies," he spat. "All of you are liars." Another voice joined in. "It's not a lie. He made my son stand in the middle of the market with a sign around his neck." This time it was a middle-aged woman, her face etched with anger and pain. "We were too afraid to speak out, but not anymore." One by one, people began to step forward, sharing their stories. The whispers grew into a wave of voices, their collective courage finally drowning out the fear that had silenced them for so long. The vendor's expression shifted from anger to something closer to panic as the tide turned against him. Aaliyah pulled out her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the afternoon light. She started recording, capturing the scene unfolding before her. The vendor's bluster faltered as he realized the power of the moment was slipping from his grasp. "Put that away," he roared, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. "I'm just showing the truth." The vendor lunged toward her, but before he could get close, several men from the crowd stepped between them. "That's enough," one of them said firmly. "You've had your way for too long." At that moment, a uniformed police officer pushed through the crowd. His face was tense, his gaze flicking between Aaliyah, the vendor, and the gathering of townsfolk. "What's going on here?" Aaliyah's voice was steady as she replied, "He's been threatening people for years. There are dozens of stories, and I have proof." She handed the officer her phone, showing him the post, the photos, and the testimonies she had gathered. The officer's expression hardened as he scrolled through the evidence. He looked up at the vendor, who now seemed smaller, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the truth. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," the officer said firmly. The vendor protested, his voice rising in desperation. "This is ridiculous. She's just a kid. You can't believe her over me." But the crowd had spoken, their voices no longer silenced by fear. The officer escorted the vendor away, his protests fading into the background. As the crowd began to disperse, Aaliyah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Aaliyah. You broke the silence." Aaliyah smiled faintly, the weight of the past weeks lifting slightly. "We did it," she said, looking around at the people who had finally found their voices. For the first time since she arrived in the town, Aaliyah felt something new, a sense of belonging, not because she had changed, but because she had helped the town change. The morning after the confrontation, Aaliyah woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. For the first time in weeks, her heart felt lighter. The events of the previous day had been a whirlwind: anger, fear, courage, and finally, a sense of triumph. She stretched, letting the sunlight filter onto her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel proud. Downstairs, Margaret was already bustling about in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed tea wafting through the air. Aaliyah joined her, and they shared a quiet moment over breakfast. Margaret looked at her granddaughter with a mix of pride and tenderness. "You did something extraordinary, Elia," Margaret said softly. "You gave this town a voice it didn't know it had." Aaliyah smiled, though her mind was already racing with what came next. "It's not over yet, Grandma. He's gone, but that doesn't mean everything will change overnight. People still need to know the whole story." Margaret nodded. "Then tell it, my dear. You've already proven you have the courage." By midday, the town was buzzing with the news of the vendor's arrest. Word spread quickly that Aaliyah's social media account had been the catalyst. People began stopping her in the street, not with the cold stares of before, but with gratitude and curiosity. An older woman approached her outside the general store. "I saw your posts," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My grandson, he was one of the kids that man hurt. I never thought anyone would stand up to him." Aaliyah thanked her, the woman's words filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that her fight wasn't just about exposing one man's cruelty. It was about healing the wounds he had left behind. The local police department reached out later that day, requesting copies of the evidence Aaliyah had gathered. The officer she met with was professional and kind, assuring her that the vendor would face charges for his actions. Aaliyah handed over her phone, every photo and video meticulously saved. But the moment wasn't without its challenges. Some residents still viewed her efforts with skepticism, their reluctance to embrace change manifesting in whispered doubts and sideways glances. "Why stir up trouble?" one shopkeeper muttered as she passed. Things were fine the way they were. Aaliyah clenched her fists but held her tongue. She knew that change often came with resistance, and she wasn't about to let a few dissenting voices diminish her resolve. In the following days, Aaliyah's social media account transformed into a platform for the town's stories. Victims who had once been too afraid to speak began sharing their experiences publicly. Their courage inspired others, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond the market vendor's actions. Stories of systemic injustice and small-town prejudice came to light, sparking difficult but necessary conversations. Margaret joined Aaliyah in her efforts, offering her wisdom and support. Together, they organized a community meeting at the town hall. It was the first event of its kind, a space where people could openly discuss the changes they wanted to see in their town. The hall was packed that evening, the air buzzing with nervous anticipation. Aaliyah stood at the front, her heart pounding as she prepared to address the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "When I started this, I didn't know what would happen. I was scared, just like many of you, but I realized that fear only has power if we let it. Together, we can change that." Her words were met with a wave of applause. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories, their voices gaining strength with every testimony. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the town was ready to confront its past and work toward a better future. The turning point came when a local journalist picked up Aaliyah's story. The reporter, a young woman named Clara, interviewed Aaliyah for an article that would run in the regional paper. Clara was deeply moved by Aaliyah's courage and the impact of her social media campaign. "This isn't just a story about a market vendor," Clara said during their interview. "It's about standing up to fear and creating change. People need to hear this." When the article was published, it garnered widespread attention. Messages of support flooded Aaliyah's inbox, many from people who had faced similar struggles in their own communities. Her story resonated far beyond the borders of the small town. As the summer drew to a close, Aaliyah felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. She had accomplished so much, but there was still work to be done. The town was changing, but change was slow and often met with resistance. On her final day, Margaret surprised her with a small gathering in the garden. Neighbors and friends came to show their appreciation, bringing flowers and handwritten notes of gratitude. Ellie was there, her shyness replaced with a newfound confidence. "Thank you, Aaliyah," Ellie said, her voice steady. "You showed me that it's okay to speak up. I'll never forget that." Aaliyah hugged her, feeling a deep sense of connection. For the first time, she truly felt like she belonged. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aaliyah sat on the porch swing, reflecting on the summer that had changed her life. She opened her notebook, its pages filled with stories, plans, and ideas. One particular thought stood out, written in bold letters. "The truth has power when people are brave enough to tell it." She smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. Her voice, once a whisper, had become a roar, and she wasn't about to let it fade. The train station was quiet as Aaliyah stood on the platform with Margaret, the late summer air carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. Her bags were packed, her ticket tucked into the front pocket of her jacket. She was returning to the city, to her parents, her school, and her life. But something inside her had shifted profoundly over the past months. She wasn't just leaving a small town. She was leaving a piece of herself behind. Margaret hugged her tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done so much here, Aaliyah. Don't ever forget that." Aaliyah smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "I won't, Grandma. I'll keep going. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." The train arrived with a loud whistle, the brakes screeching as it slowed to a stop. Margaret waved as Aaliyah boarded, her figure growing smaller as the train pulled away. Aaliyah settled into her seat, the countryside rolling past the window. She pulled out her notebook, flipping through the pages filled with plans, reflections, and the stories that had come to define her summer. Back in the city, life resumed its normal rhythm, but Aaliyah couldn't shake the fire that had been ignited in her. The town had taught her something invaluable, that one voice, even one as small as hers, could spark a movement. It wasn't long before she began looking for ways to continue the work she had started. She shared her story at school, presenting it during a community engagement project. Her classmates listened, rapt, as she recounted the struggles she faced and the triumphs she witnessed. Many of them were inspired, approaching her afterward to ask how they could help or share similar experiences of their own. Aaliyah decided to expand her social media account, transforming Voice of the Silenced into a platform for youth activism. She invited people from all over to share their stories of standing up to injustice, creating a network of support and solidarity. The account grew rapidly, with followers from across the country joining in. Months later, Aaliyah received a letter from Ellie. It was handwritten on floral stationery, the words carefully crafted. "Dear Aaliyah, things are better here now. People are more open, and the market feels like a different place. I even started volunteering at the community center to help younger kids find their confidence. It's all because of you. Thank you for being brave enough to show us the way." Your friend, Ellie Aaliyah, read the letter twice, her chest swelling with pride and warmth. She replied immediately, encouraging Ellie to keep pushing for change and sharing her story. Ellie's words were a reminder that even small victories could plant seeds of transformation. As the months turned into a year, Aaliyah found herself speaking at events and collaborating with local organizations to advocate for equity and justice. Her story became a rallying cry, proving that anyone, regardless of age or background, could make a difference. One day, while preparing for a talk at a youth leadership conference, Aaliyah received a surprising message. Clara, the journalist who had covered her story, reached out to say that a major publisher was interested in turning Aaliyah's experiences into a book. At first, Aaliyah was overwhelmed by the idea, but Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "You've done so much. Don't ever forget that." Aaliyah decided to say yes. The book became her next project, a way to document not just her story, but the stories of everyone who had been brave enough to speak out. It was titled Seeds of Change, a tribute to the small moments that grow into movements. The book's release was met with critical acclaim, and Aaliyah found herself at the center of a national conversation about youth activism and community resilience. She was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even city councils, each event reinforcing the power of her voice. But no matter how far her journey took her, she always carried the memory of that small town. The garden, the market, the people who found their courage alongside her. She often visited Margaret, bringing stories of her travels and updates on the impact they had created together. One summer evening, Aaliyah stood in Margaret's garden, the air thick with the scent of blooming flowers. Margaret joined her, a cup of tea in hand. "You've done incredible things, Aaliyah," Margaret said, her voice soft but full of pride. "But what's next?" Aaliyah looked out at the rows of vibrant flowers, a smile spreading across her face. "I think it's time to plant new seeds," she said. "There's still so much work to do." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Aaliyah felt the certainty of her purpose take root, ready to grow into something even greater. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that make you think. Share this video with your friends to discuss what you think, and be sure to check out the other videos. Each story reveals something important. Your comments and support help us keep going.